So when we're talking through that moisture is the key, the other big thing around it is that while mold needs water to grow, which is true, it does not need water to stay. And this might be the biggest thing that people don't get. So I had a leak in my ceiling. We fixed the pipe. The leak is gone and we dried the ceiling. Can't be mold because mold needs water to grow. No. You had water come through the ceiling. It got your ceiling drywall wet. Mold grew on the top of your ceiling. Then you dried it all. The mold is still there. And then you closed it up. And now you have a mold source in your ceiling above your bed, for example, which is what happened to me, which is how I got into this.
Hey guys, welcome back. You're listening to the Ancient Health Podcast. I'm so excited that you've tuned in today, that you're listening. This is going to be a valuable conversation for you, for everybody. So don't check out if you think that this problem might not be affecting you or your family, because I guarantee you there are things here, some tips and pearls that you've never heard anywhere else. And we really have the best of the best with us. I've been following Brian Karr for some time. You might actually be following him too, because he is probably the leader in education around mold. And that's our topic of conversation today. So we're going to bring him in, go over everything from how to test your home to the chronic disease symptoms that can result as of an exposure to mold, and how to know if you're affected. So we've got a lot of road to cover today, but I know that this is going to be a useful tool for you when it comes to your health, because in those times where you can't seem to find the missing link or the piece of the puzzle, I find that mold is one of the underlying causes for most people's downfall to their health. And it's the one that's never addressed. So today's conversation is an important one to have. Brian, thank you so much for joining us today. I know this is going to be so fun.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. And I've been following you on social for so long. I've reposted so much of your content because you do such a fabulous job, I feel like, of making mold and the conversation around mold something that people can understand. Like, they understand what the problem is and they understand what the ramifications are if you don't address it. And you give solutions. So it's not just like, here's a bunch of scary things that you need to be worried about for your health. You really advocate for people, and you've helped thousands, tens of thousands of people with chronic conditions, like the people that never get well. And we all know somebody where it's like, man, they've seen everybody, they've tried every supplement, regimen, detox, you name it. And not one doctor can figure it out. But usually I always think, I'm like, you know what, there's got to be a mold piece. And that's where you dedicated your life's work. So I'm excited to unpack all of it.
I am too. And you said it exactly right. I see what you just described all the time, right?
Yeah.
I've been sick forever. Nobody can figure it out. We're treating symptoms. We're not actually fixing the problem. Or I'm just doomed to live like this forever, right? And it's, so many times there are, like, our bodies are pretty incredible machines, if you think of them that way. And they're like self-healing machines on top of it. So for it not to be like healing itself, there's something just impeding its path. There's something wrong. It just has to get kind of tweaked. And then it snaps right back into shape, and it starts doing what it's meant to do. It's really cool to see it happen.
That is so cool. And that, like, it's so amazing when when you can get the body in a healing state. It really does. It does the work for you. You don't have to get up every day and keep putting the pieces back together. Sometimes it's a matter of removing, getting in the right environment, and allowing your body to do what it's designed to ultimately get to that place of healing. So I want to come out of the gate, and I want to address this because I had mentioned this earlier before we started recording, but there are a lot of people that, one, don't realize that mold is a really prevalent problem in our modern world that we live in, because we live in, what really is like a sterile environment, right? We've like sanitized and we've just sterilized everything. But there's probably a number of people that just think that this isn't relevant to them because of their living situation. Maybe they are in a new build or new construction, or maybe they don't live in a climate that's super swampy and wet all the time. So they think, oh, that's not, anything I have to worry about. So I'd love for you to give us kind of a snapshot of where we are right now in terms of the prevalence of mold and how it's impacting people no matter where you live.
Yeah, it's a lot. There's a lot of ways to go on this. I mean, to start, and I'll almost start with like the objections that come up when you start talking about mold, right? And the first thing is, there's been mold for since cavemen, and we didn't know about these things way back then. And there's like so many responses to that. But I feel like the root of all of that is just like a lack of just understanding. I think a lot of everything we have an internal belief or an opinion that's created at some point in time. And then that becomes kind of our anchor point that we kind of judge everything against, right? And so if we've never learned that smoking cigarettes was bad for us, then in the 1970s, when dad was smoking literally while mom was giving birth in the room, like that wouldn't have happened if we knew what we knew later, right? And then all of a sudden we know, and now God forbid somebody has a cigarette within 100 feet of somebody. It's like the end of the world, right? And it's taken time for this shift to happen, specifically in that land of, in the lens of cigarette smoking and the understanding of what it can do to you. But what's interesting about cigarette smoking specifically is that there were research studies done very early on where we knew that cigarettes cause cancer. It was known, right? And this is, and the reason I bring this up is because mold is kind of following a really similar path that cigarettes followed right now. Um, there was a point where like nobody thought about it, nobody cared about it. It was what it was. And then you get like some crazy person with a crazy idea that's like, wait, what if this thing is causing this thing over here? And they go and they dedicate time in their life and they try to do research and they, kind of become a pioneer in the field, and everyone else in the field is kind of shunning them at the time because they're like the one person that's doing something different and it's not normal. It's not what everybody thinks. In our industry, there's a doctor. His name was Dr. Richie Shoemaker. I say our industry because he's a doctor. I'm not a doctor, right? But the way that we go through things is it's all driven by health. So myself, my journey, my company, it's everything is completely health focused in our approach to how we do stuff. And he was the person that opened up, kind of turned the light on that said, hey, people, this is a problem. Now, the issue is that for years after that, nobody cared, right? Because this guy's crazy guy, crazy idea. There's no way this is true. And what he basically figured out is that 24% of the population have a genetic mutation that doesn't allow them to detox environmental toxins properly, and mold is a big piece of that. So literally a quarter of the U.S. of the population, excuse me, can't get this stuff out of their body, right? So think about like you eat something that's not good for you. There's pesticides around, there's glyphosate over here, there's heavy metals over here, there's all this stuff that we kind of hear otherwise that we have to detox our bodies from. And our bodies have a natural detoxification process. But for 25% of people, that doesn't work. And so what was happening is that the toxins were building and building and building in people's bodies. And then they were starting to manifest in symptoms that were all over the place in their bodies, right? Which we can get into in a minute. But just to kind of wrap this point up. So what happened after that study, it took over 30 years for the very first sort of governmental intervention in the form of a you're not allowed to smoke cigarettes somewhere type of thing happened, right? We knew for 30 years. And in that process, first it was the crazy guy with crazy idea, but then all the other experts that are kind of in that world, they start doing their own research and they reference it. And then they start expanding and they do their own studies and they start proving and they start proving and they start proving. And then finally, it's not like crazy and stupid anymore. It's like, oh, this is a real thing, but the general medical community is not on board. Why? Because it doesn't benefit them to understand why something is happening if you can't just give a pill to it, right? And this is just an opinion, obviously, like it is what it is. But like it takes a lot. There's lobbyists going on. There's so much going on to change an infrastructure as big as like the pharmaceutical industry and the medical industry, that even though we know things are hurting people, it's going to take 20, 30 years for any sort of movement to change. And the only reason it happens is because there's such an upswell of the people pushing forward that now there's like this scale, right? And as soon as the scale goes over to the other side, where the large companies are like, oh, now if we don't do something, now we're doing something wrong. It's like they have to be forced to do something that changes what's happening, right? And so that happened with cigarettes. And that's what's happening with mold right now. Now with cigarettes, it took 30 years for the very first thing to happen. We're in like the very first like 5-10 year cycle of what happened in cigarettes. And the reason I give that whole like analogy between the two is because imagine if you knew 20 years ahead that if I stopped smoking 20 years before, the state of California said something, forget the rest of the country, just the state of California, it's not even everywhere else, said, oh, you can't smoke on these planes now. right? Like if we knew that we could stop smoking and what it caused 20 years ago, who in our lives hasn't been impacted by somebody or known somebody who's impacted by someone who smoked a lot, and cancer was, was kind of the output of that. And that's where we are with this right now. And the reason I'm so passionate about this is because I, for some reason, feel like I have this opportunity to kind of like sway the path of humanity in a way in my little neck of the woods to avoid a lot of these chronic health issues that you're talking about. And they are, and they're significant, and they're not good. And there's things we can do to get around it. And it's as easy as, what are you breathing? Right? Because it's such a big part of what your body takes in and what it's exposed to.
Gosh, I never really thought about it like that. And the comparison to smoking. I mean, what do you feel like is missing? Because you're right, by way of looking at it with the medical community, this is why so many people can be in a household, right? You can have a whole family and you've got one person that is just chronically ill and everybody else is fine. And then they go to the doctor and the doctor's like, we can't really find anything, must just be in your head. And these people are like, am I really going crazy? Because this stuff seems really real. But then they look around at their other, they're like, okay, well, if it is my environment, why is nobody else sick? And so the genetic piece is really interesting there. But what is it that needs to be regulated? Is it the building codes? Is it building materials? Like, is it the way that we're approaching, people's health, like on the side of, hey, the healing side, and just not ignoring people? Like, what do you feel like needs to happen, in order for this not to be something that just continues to take people out?
I think the quickest way for something to happen is not to rely on any of that stuff and for us to understand it ourselves. We're in this amazing time right now where we actually are able to drive the decisions that impact us. Whereas if you look 30, 50 years ago, there was no social media, there was no pushback from like community. Everyone really probably felt more isolated because there was no way to kind of congregate in any sort of way and actually drive action the way that you can now. But even forget about driving change, forget about that for a large group. Think about it for yourself. You now have access to research, to all kinds of things that exist. You can do your own self-advocating. I literally had somebody reach out to me after listening to my podcast a lot, apparently. She dove into it. Her kid had autism. She dove into the podcast. She realized that mold was a contributing factor. She listened to hundreds of hours of it. She was taking notes, and she solved her entire problem by herself without ever calling us or giving us a dollar or even telling us she existed. And being able to take that and couple it with all the research she was doing on the health side for her kid to understand what might be happening. Here's a place of a solution that resonates with me, that makes sense. I'm going to do these things that I would never have access to 20 years ago. And I'm literally going to change the life of my child. Like, that is the world we live in. So when you ask the question, like, what's the thing, the one thing we can do, it's do what she did. That's the thing that we can do for ourselves and quickly. When you talk about the things like what is hampering the development, I mean, you kind of hit them. The building industry is no different than the pharmaceutical industry. Like, think of, and we've seen these numbers, 5%, I don't know what the number is, but 5% of real estate is owned, or the majority of real estate is owned by 5%, right? And we know that these trends, everyone's renting now. That's the trend of real estate. That's the trend of the economy, right? And so we lose more control and more control. Do you think those 5 or 10% of the people that own all the buildings are going to want to have to go in here and actually do real remediations that cost real money to go? The answer is no. So they're going to push it down. They're going to lobby against it, right? There's just so much. And then there's the health side of it. You take this example of her name was Fallon that I just talked about. She figured out the building stuff on her own. Then there was the health stuff. Now you have the whole health industry that's not really wrapping their head around this for similar reasons. And if you're relying on these two massive, massive industries basically to say, you know what, forget about the bottom line. We're going to have to change a whole lot of stuff. We're going to be spending way more money, but you know what? You're going to feel better in your house. Hold your breath. It's not going to happen. So
Yeah.
we have to take this into ourselves. But the nice thing about the time that we're in right now is that we can,
Yeah.
and there's so much information out there to allow us to do it. We just have to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it really is so true. Gosh, I love that story because it is such a picture of really like what the average person can do. Like you are in the driver's seat. So learning this information and finding reputable people to link arms with will give you the resources and you can do a lot of it. Like it's scary to think that the onus is on us sometimes because we think, oh gosh, we don't know. But every day you're solving problems. So this is just no different. It's just a matter of, hey, can you stick with it? Can you really spend and invest the time and the resources to learn it? Because I mean, at the end of the day, it matters, right? If your health matters, then yeah, that time is valuable for sure. I want to ask this too because the autism piece and link to mold is very interesting. What other symptoms have you seen that have been associated? Could be childhood related, or it could be in adults. But I think that there are some diagnoses, and there are symptoms that people have been carrying for a long time that doctors have just said, well, that's just what you have, when in fact it could be something that is derived, or the root cause being mold.
There's so much. There's so much. And let me just preface this that like it's not always just mold either. I think just generally understanding that there are a lot of things that go into how we feel and what's happening, and a lot of things that we can control, and it's we're not at the beck and call of the doctor for us to go in our 15 minutes and for them to say you are this person now, you are arthritis, you are depression, you are this, here's your pill to fix that thing, and then that's what it is. On the mold side, when we talked earlier, and you were setting the stage really well too, of like these chronic conditions. So I just had Dr. Tom O'Brien on my show, and he
Oh, I
said
love him.
something. Yeah, he I met him years ago actually, which is crazy. It was really cool. And but anyways, he said something, and he said 14 of the top 15 highest causes of death are the result of low grade chronic inflammation.
Wow.
So the only one out of the 15 was like car accidents or like random things that happen to kill people. Other than that, everything, cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, cancer, a neurodegenerative thing, all of that stuff has a direct correlation to low grade chronic inflammation. So like what does that mean? What does that mean? So like our bodies, if we're exposed to something that shouldn't be there, we have this little army in our body. Basically, it's the inflammatory guys, right? And they come in, and it's our immune system. They come in and they basically light fire to wherever the bad stuff is. So imagine like coming in and being like, there's something really bad in this house. I'm going to burn this whole house down to make sure that the thing that's bad in this house doesn't get out of the house and go somewhere else, right? That's kind of what's happening. And so your immune system goes and they basically light it on fire. So that's the inflammation piece of it. So when you're exposed to something chronically, and even at low grade, the low grade piece of it is that symptoms don't manifest when you're at that piece of it.
Yeah.
So if you're just low grade breathing stuff in, and it's not even to the point where it's manifesting symptoms, which I can go into in a second, what we see a lot, you still have this inflammatory response in your body that's happening at all times. And inflammation, per Dr. O'Brien, is the cause of 14 of 15 of the top 15 ways that you die, right? So mold is one of the things that creates inflammation. And when I talked about Dr. Shoemaker earlier about being the pioneer of this, what he essentially figured out after this genetic mutation that he found, he called it chronic inflammatory response syndrome. So back to this chronic inflammatory thing. Basically, your body is in a constant state of inflammation because it's being exposed to something and it can't get rid of it. So now imagine that the house that you're trying to burn down never burns down. You just keep lighting it up, right? And that's what happens if you're one of these 24% of people with that specific genetic issue. It just keeps going and going and going. But if you get past like the low grade, I don't feel any symptom stuff, and you get into the, hey, how am I feeling? What's going on? The very easiest thing to think about, and you described the journey earlier. I haven't been feeling right. It's been a long time. I've been to a bunch of doctors. Nobody can figure it out. They put me on a symptom-based protocol. If that is you, I'm not saying it's mold specifically, but you need to look at environmental triggers that you're being exposed to, because those things in your body don't happen unless something is coming exposing you're being exposed to something that your body's responding to, right? And so I think, a lot of times it's hard for people to wrap their head around the specific symptoms. So just think of like the general concept. I've been beating this drum for 5 years and I'm not any better, and no doctor can figure it out, and they're all like, I guess this is just what your life is like. If that is the case, look at mold immediately, because like you said, Courtney, like it is so often actually what the root trigger is. If you get into the symptom portion of it now, beyond that, the thing that's really tough to diagnose, and I think why most doctors can't really do it very well, is because a mold exposure issue manifests in a multi-system, multi-symptom profile. So what does that mean? So our body we have multiple systems, right? You have your circulatory system, you have your nervous system, you have your, all the, your endocrine system. So that's your hormones. You have all these things in your body, right? So you have brain, you have gut, you have breathing, you have hormones and all that stuff. So those are your systems. And then multi-symptom, meaning different symptoms in each of those places, right? So you might have somebody who has gut problems, but they also have brain fog, and they also have tingling in their fingers or something. And all these things that don't really seem to correlate or make any sense at all. But that is like a classic, like multi-system, multi-symptom problem, right? So the thing that's tough about mold is it kind of finds the weakest link, right? So if wherever your body is weakest, that's where it's going to manifest most often. So that's a tough part. But I would say really common things that happen is brain fog and neurological issues are really, really common. So that's tied to the autism piece as well. Gut issues are very common. Skin issues are very common. If you have a toxin buildup and you're not getting rid of it, it will come out of your skin. And this is one of my problems that I'm constantly dealing with, because I was done this for a decade. I only got called when there was bad problems. So I tricked my body into thinking that I lived in the worst house that existed for like a decade. And even though I'm wearing all the protective gear and all the things, there's only so much you can do if you keep exposing yourself to the thing all the time. So guys, imagine me fully suited up, knowing what I'm walking into and being prepared for it, and still having the physiological effects that came from that, as opposed to somebody who's just living in the house the whole time, right? And that's the difference. So those are some of the main things. But I think if you just kind of look at your situation and your path and like, man, that actually, the symptoms might not line up exactly with what Brian just said, but there's way more than what I just said. If the path kind of sounds like what you've been on, then I just think that you got to look at it, and you got to at least say, okay, is this a thing or is it not a thing? And there's really easy ways to do it too.
Yeah. And I think too, if you can, if you are brain fogged and you're like, I just don't know, I can't even remember like when I started feeling bad, even asking somebody like, hey, do you remember the last time I wasn't complaining or mentioning these headaches or fatigue or joint pain? And starting to look at a calendar of like, yeah, well, it was like, a month after I moved into this apartment or whatever. And then like even look at vacations, because some people will notice immediately they get out of their environment for a week or 10 days or whatever. And like their diet is probably not great because you're on vacation, maybe having some drinks, and yet they still feel unbelievable. It's like they've just gotten out of this bubble that's been making them sick. And even with all the extras that probably are not, the greatest for your health, you're still improving. So, I mean, that's always
it's so funny that you say that, because I haven't thought of it like that. But literally, like, you go on vacation, you're pouring liquid poison into your body at like 10 times the rate that you normally would, and you feel better. And you're like, it's a big thing.
It's crazy. This actually happened to a house that I used to live in. And every time I would leave town, and it didn't even have to be, it could be 3 to 5 days. And, I mean, I don't have, and like, I live obviously a very healthy lifestyle, super intentional about, just everything with like air purifiers, water purifiers, like non-toxic everything. And yet, but we had a mold issue. And so I would leave town and I would lose like 3 pounds of weight, and it was complete inflammation. And again, like I said, I was eating out, which I normally don't do. So I'm getting like inflammatory seed oils, and I'm drinking water out of water bottles. There's like microplastics, all this stuff that I normally don't even get. And yet I'm not in the gym, not doing any of my normal stuff. And I'm dropping weight, and it's inflammation, right? Because I'm just living in this toxic home, bound in this place that is ultimately driving that inflammatory response 24/7. So, I mean, it's just kind of crazy to think like how many people like just think about it like that, maybe as a starting point, because I think that may help put some pieces into place. What what is it about somebody's environment? So if they're in their house, maybe they suspect mold, or maybe they're just like, well, I really don't know. Are there any indicators in people's home environment that should clue them into, hey, I need to do some further testing?
Yeah. I mean, first, your body is one. We've talked through it, how you're feeling, what's going on, right? The other thing is just know before I get into this, because I think a lot of people, there's still like a stigma around having like mold in your house, like, oh, you don't keep a clean house, or you're disgusting or something like that. Like people are like, it can't be my house, never be my house. Like, it has nothing to do with you. It has nothing to do with how clean you keep your house. It has nothing to do with how good of a parent you are to your kids. Like, take all of that out. It's literally everywhere. And so it's not anyone's fault, but there are things that happen. And one quick thing before I get into that too is that there's always like a level of mold in a house. There's mold outside, right? So you're always going to have some sort of cross that's moving in and out. The goal is not zero exposure. And I think sometimes people get hung up on that because, like, well, mold is everywhere. You can't get away from mold. It's not about zero exposure. It's about anything else in life. It's about too much of something is bad for you, right? So, like, our body can detox. If I drink once a month, like, sure, I might not feel great the next day, but I'm generally fine, right? But if I'm an alcoholic that's pounding 5 a day, there are like significant health problems that come along with that, right? And it's the same thing. If I happen to get some mold that comes into my body because I opened the doors and I have some plants outside, and God forbid some of that comes in and there's mold everywhere and there's no escaping it, that's one thing. If I had a leak, or I have something, or I have these things going on where I literally have mold growing in the wall behind where I'm sleeping, or in my air conditioning system, every time I turn it on, that's blowing out into the space that I'm breathing, that's the equivalent of being an alcoholic and drinking 5 times a day. And so we just have to understand the difference between those two things, and know that the path to not feeling like crap when you drink is not drink as much, right? The path to not feeling like crap when there's a mold issue in your house is to not have as much mold in your house. It doesn't mean it has to be zero. It just means you want to have not as much, right? And so when we're talking about like, what are the things in the house? What are the triggers? What are the clues? Like all that stuff. I say this all the time. I don't know when I started saying it. I just like it. But like this whole secret to finding mold is to not look for it at all. That's how we don't look for it. And if you're going and looking for mold, you're not going to find it because most of it's hidden. And so if your goal as an inspector, or even you in your house, like, I'm going to go and look for black stuff on walls, and if I don't see black stuff on walls, and I don't have a mold problem, that is 100% not true. And so I want to kind of like take that off to the side. Most mold is behind something. Uh, it needs moisture, it needs humidity, it needs stagnation, right? It needs things like that to grow. So you're not going to always see it on the front end surface where you have more airflow and you have things like that going on. It's going to happen behind the scenes. That's usually where it's going to happen. But the thing that really causes mold to grow is moisture, right? Now, the big misconception around it is that if someone says, well, I've never had a flood, so I can't have a mold problem. I said moisture. I didn't say a flood, right? I didn't say like a big leak. I just said moisture. And that can be a lot of different things. One of the biggest places that we find mold in almost every house that we go into is under a kitchen, or not a kitchen sink, under a sink, like a cabinet under a sink. So I have like 4 bathrooms in my house. So there's 4 sink cabinets, and one of them has 2 sinks. So there's 5 sink cabinets in my house, right? This is like, if I had to put my money down, if someone was like, you only get one shot of something to look at in a house to find something and your life depends on it, I'd be opening every sink cabinet. That would be where I went to, right? And think about what happens in there. You put a lot of stuff under there. You put a lot of stuff under there means you can't see what's going on. You've now stored all of your crap under your sink, which everybody does, no judgment. And in doing so, you have no idea what's under there. You don't even want to open it because it's like going to come out and attack you, right? So you don't even look under your sink very often. So your door stays shut to your sink cabinets. You got a bunch of stuff in there. And then what's all under there? There's plumbing lines all under there. There's connections to your faucet where the sink goes into the counter. There's plumbing in the wall. There's all this stuff. And anywhere where a little drip starts happening, that's your moisture,
Yeah.
right? And it can go on for an extended period of time and you won't even know about it because you got all this stuff under there and you don't open the cabinet, right? I can't even tell you the number of times I go into a house, open the cabinet, pull the stuff out, and it was black everywhere. I didn't even need to look. Like, it's just obvious. It's like, guys, just pull some stuff out, right? Like, but nobody
We don't
thinks of
want to
this
do
stuff.
that.
Nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to do
Nobody
that.
wants to do that.
So when we're talking through that moisture is the key, the other big thing around it is that while mold needs water to grow, which is true, it does not need water to stay. And this might be the biggest thing that people don't get. So I had a leak in my ceiling. We fixed the pipe. The leak is gone and we dried the ceiling. Can't be mold because mold needs water to grow. No. You had water come through the ceiling. It got your ceiling drywall wet. Mold grew on the top of your ceiling. Then you dried it all. The mold is still there. And then you closed it up. And now you have a mold source in your ceiling above your bed, for example, which is what happened to me, which is how I got into this. So that was dried. The landlords came in. Everything's fine. Everything's fine. You're good. What did they do? They brought in their person and they did an air test. They said, oh, everything's fine. The air test says everything's fine. And lo and behold, I literally was living in an entire box covered in mold behind every wall because I had a massive flood through a pipe in my ceiling. And that's how it started. And so when we're thinking about what are the things in the house, before looking through your house, think about anywhere that you've had a leak historically. And that is a place where there is a high probability of a mold problem. And I was talking like last month or last year when we've gone into houses that are 30 years old and the people have lived in it for 15 and they bought it from someone else. Yeah. And we find an area of historical water damage, which isn't hard to find once you know what you're looking for. And we ask the person who lives in there, hey, what happened over here? And they're like, I don't know. I have no idea what this is. So this leak that happened over here happened at least 15 years ago because it was before you came in.
Yeah.
And we test it and it's like a massive source of mold in the house that they're being exposed to. It stays. Just like if you had a plant or like your grass outside, if you stop watering your grass, the grass doesn't just like get up and go find another yard that's watering. The grass stays there. It gets dry. It gets sharp, and it stays, right? And what happens after that with mold specifically, to kind of close the loop on this, when mold dries, it becomes incredibly brittle and it can break apart very easily. So for any of you listening, if you've ever gotten a flower from somebody, your partner or somebody who's dating you, ever given a flower, whatever. I tell the story a lot because I saw it happen and it was just so crazy. When I was courting my wife, I just bought her so many flowers, try to get her to like me. And she would hang them all upside down on the wall after, kind of their lifespan was up, right? So she would hang them all upside down. Why do we hang them upside down? Because if not, they're going to break and fall over because they've kind of lost their lifeblood in the water, right? So she hangs them all upside down. I walk into her room one day. There's like 15 dead flowers basically hanging on her upside down. I'm like, I think we get it. This is feeling a little morbid in here. I'm going to come clean these flowers up. I'm going to go get rid of these. And I walk in and I grab them, not knowing any better. And what do they do when you grab flowers and they're hanging upside down?
Oh, they all break.
They shatter.
Yeah.
They break and they shatter. And we live in California, so she lived at the time at a spot by the beach. There's no air conditioning in these little condo units that were by the beach because they were all built in the 50s or whatever. So she had like an oscillating fan by the door. So the fan just kind of turning back and forth, and she has the fan on all the time to get some air in. So literally, it's like right when I grab it and they all shatter and they start falling, the fan comes by and hits them, and they fly out into the room. And they're in the carpet fibers. They're in her whole like vanity nightstand thing that's over there. Okay. I now spend the next hour trying to clean up and find every single one of these things in her room that I destroyed and put everywhere. That exact same thing happens if you had a leak in your ceiling 15 years ago and then a little air pressure change in your house happens, which happens all the time, and it breaks pieces of it apart and it pulls it into your house, and that's how you breathe it. And that's why a leak that happened 15 years ago and mold that grew from that can still be impacting you today. And that's why it's so important to understand where these things happen. So if we're saying, what are the things we do? The first thing before you look for anything is sit down, say, what leaks do I know about that have happened in this house since I've been here? Little things. How many times has the garbage disposal had a little drip? Just literally anything, even these tiny little things. And don't even think leaks. Think anywhere water happens. Do I have kids? What does their shower look like when I go in there? What does the wall next to the shower look like? Do they splash out when they take a bath? That is a water
Does
source.
it splash water? Because mine, it's like, I'm like, did we keep water at all in the tub?
You know
Well,
what's funny about that? So it's funny. So you feel like, people feel like we can't control this, right? We don't have control of this. My kids do this thing. I think it's like a life lesson. I know a lot about this, obviously. So my daughter's 5, and I have a son who's 2.5 right now. So when she was growing up, as soon as she was old enough to know, which is around 2.5, so we're starting to do the same thing with him. If one drop of water comes out of this tub, bad time's over. No more fun. And you know what she learned? Water doesn't come out of this tub, and she doesn't splash at all. And I never have to worry about water coming out of the tub. And so it's one of these things that we feel like that we don't maybe have control over,
yeah.
but maybe we can if we put some attention toward it and like awareness toward it, right? So it's just like a side just
That's
from what
so
you
funny.
said.
I'm gonna tell my kids next time that Mr. Brian's coming over to drop the hammer if they if they start splashing.
Well,
I'll
I
be
don't know
like,
how old your kids are. I don't know if it'll work at this point.
yeah, well, I have a whole age range. The older ones that wouldn't be relevant to, but I have a 1 year old, and yeah, she's a little fiery pistol right now. But yeah, she's the one I got to worry about. So
So yeah,
was
that's the biggest thing. It's like almost like taking inventory of places where there's been like leak issues or where water occurs most often, and then go look in those places too. So now, like, what are the things you can look for? So there's really only 5 visual clues that there's been a water issue. And so my entire team, how we train all of our team is around understanding these. We call them the 5 signs of hidden mold growth, because if you see those, that's the thing our eyes can see. And then that drives us to the point like, hey, we want to test here because we're seeing proof that there is a likelihood there's been a water issue here at some point in time. We're going to test here. And that's our entire philosophy for going through homes. Sure, we use moisture meters and infrared cameras and stuff, but frankly, like, you're going to miss 80 to 90% of the problems in a house if that's all that you do. So we
yeah,
have to like actually inspect a house. So funny is that most mold inspectors don't inspect anything. They come in, they put an air sample in the middle of a room, and they're out of your house in a half hour, and they've not looked at anything. So they should
yeah,
really just be called like sample jockeys or like like whatever they are, because they're not inspecting anything, right?
no, oh
So
my gosh, you're so right.
so the 5 signs. So these are 5 things, okay? This is how water and moisture manifests in your house. So you do what I did first, kind of outline anywhere that that there's been issue. Those are automatically going to be things that you're going to want to check out. And then you go to the areas where moisture is a lot, where water is a lot. So just think where plumbing is: bathrooms, laundry rooms, kitchens, those types of places. And then you're going to look for these 5 things. So the first thing is bubbling paint. So bubbling paint, and it's not just like paint, like obvious. When you look, you need to like really look, not just like scan your eyes over, right? This is why most people don't see it. And the other little trick while you're doing these things, guys, get a $15 flashlight off of Amazon. Get one of the ones that's like a tactical flashlight where you can kind of pull the top up and you can either zoom in with a really tight range of light, or you could pull it back and it gives like a very wide range of light on it. You want it to be more of a wide range of light that's not very focused in the middle, because that'll whitewash what your eyes can see. So you don't want that. So you want it to be like a wide, soft light. And then, if let's say you're looking at a wall, the way that you use your flashlight, if you're pointing your flashlight at your wall, like if you're looking at it, what you want to do is actually tilt the flashlight up and have the light run on the same plane as the wall. So if your wall is vertical, you want your flashlight to be pointing down the wall. Okay. If you're looking at a horizontal surface, you want your flashlight to be at the front of that surface and the light to go along the path of that surface. So you're like riding parallel on top of the plane of whatever you're looking at. The reason you do that is by doing it, it will cast shadows. So if you have a little tiny bubble in something that maybe your eye doesn't see, you put the flashlight on and have the light shine down on it in that way, and it's going to cast a shadow out down off the wall below. And that's how you're able to start seeing these things. I've literally had people ask me if this is some sort of special mold flashlight that costs like a lot of money. I'm like, no, you get this thing for 15 bucks. It's just how you hold it, right? And so as I'm saying these things, you can get a flashlight and literally go through your house and do these things, and
Yeah.
you'll find stuff just from like what we're talking about if you're interested in finding it anyway. So the first one is bubbling paint. Not just on walls, look at the bottoms of baseboards. So water typically happens from the ground level, right? Especially if there's like a leak under a toilet or water splash on the floor or something. So the bottom of a baseboard it'll manifest there kind of probably more often than it does like higher up on a wall, right? So you can look for it there. You'll see it in kitchen or like sink cabinets too, like areas like that. So bubbling paint, peeling paint or cracking paint, same thing. Moisture gets into an area, it can cause that kind of it dries up and then things crack and stuff like that. So it's another thing to look at. Bowing or buckling or warping. So if you run your foot over a floor and it's like warped, that's an example, right? If you feel a bump in it, if you look in a cabinet under your sink, I keep saying sink cabinets, guys, because seriously, sink cabinets, and you see a little, it's bowed a little, it's bumped up a little. It's a big sign that something has gone on there. The fourth one is like mineral deposits and chemical reactions. So think rust. So if you see rust somewhere, rust doesn't happen unless there's moisture. It needs that to happen. And for those of you that have basements, like unfinished basements or crawl spaces that you can see, that white powdery stuff that's on like the block wall down there, that's a mineral deposit. And that means that moisture at some point in time has come through here. And that's kind of the result of what that is the mineral deposit. And then the last thing is just like actual staining. You'd be surprised how many things you see just water stains on when you look for it, right? So that's it. So you do those 5 things and you look through things like that, and you can find so much in your house. You can find so much.
Yeah, okay. Those are really helpful tips and they're very easy to do. And honestly, you kind of have your hunch. Like I would imagine most people, it's like, because you live in your house. And so, the habits of your family members, that I think you maybe posted at one point about like hanging the wet towel against like the
Mm-hmm.
drywall in the
Yeah.
bathroom. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I never thought about that. But another thing I'd actually love to ask your opinion on, because this was something that I realized when we were going through our whole mold situation. A lot of homes aren't built with dehumidifiers. So if you think, okay, well, I didn't have like some really visible leak, like I didn't have water coming through the ceiling or whatever. We didn't either. We really didn't have like any issues. However, I live in South Carolina and it's very hot and humid here. And most of the new construction builds, doesn't matter. You could live in a multi-million-dollar home on the beach. They're not putting dehumidifiers in these houses. They're basically expecting the HVAC unit to regulate it by keeping it cool enough, but it's not pulling the moisture out of the air. So we ended up buying this dehumidifier. It's like from Lowe's, you plug it in, whatever. It gives you a reading as soon as it starts pulling the air in through the machine. Our humidity was at like 78% in the house.
Whoa.
I mean, it was like wet. So we didn't have necessarily a leak, but and it honestly, here's the thing. When you live in a really swampy, hot climate, so like Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, like when you walk in from being outside and it's super humid, like over 100%, and it's hot, it still feels cool. So you're like, oh, it's actually fine. But then when we saw the reading, I was like, oh my gosh, it's wet in here. Like it is actually wet. And then we get like so much of what you said. We had somebody that, the builder sent out somebody to do an air sample test, and I ended up getting in a whole altercation with him, which if you know me, that won't surprise you at all, because he was like, no, there's nothing wrong here. And I was like, I can't have a conversation with you. I ended up actually calling you guys, mole finders, and had a number of conversations and consultations and things like that, because I just thought nobody's going to believe me. But this house there's basically like humidity on the drywall because it was so humid. So that's something to consider too. If you live in a humid climate, I mean, you might think, oh, this is a new house. Ours was too. It was a brand new house and it was covered. I mean, when I tell you we had to, I mean, we don't live in that house anymore. I was like, I don't even believe that the amount of work that was done, which was pretty extensive, I was like, I'm done. I need to wash my hands of this and go somewhere else. But have you seen that just with the moisture and homes not being able to hold because the building materials are so cheap, you know?
No, I'm really glad you brought it up because we talked, what does mold need? It needs moisture. Humidity is water, right? That is a vapor form of water, and it can cause so many problems, especially when you live in the South or other places that have high humidity, right? So yes, so from the humidity perspective, you want humidity in your house under 60%. Ideally 50-ish. Like I wouldn't want to go higher than that. There are multiple mold types that can grow at or around 60%. That's all that they need to grow. Meaning you have a closet, let's say, there's not a lot of airflow, humidity spikes up. You go in the closet, there's mold all over your clothes growing in there, but there's no like leak or anything going on. That's a humidity problem, right? There's a humidity
Yep.
issue that's causing that. But that can also affect your attics a lot. So what happens in houses is that there's a thing called the stack effect. It's a building science term, but for everybody listening, probably have heard this more often, that heat rises. Everybody heard the phrase that heat rises, right? Or even if you walk upstairs, you don't have your air conditioner on, it's hotter upstairs than it is downstairs. That's an air pressure thing. It's called the stack effect. It's pushing that upward. So you always have an upward pushing movement in your house, pushing air from the bottom all the way up to the top. So your attic is the end of the line. So also attics are not conditioned typically. So if you live somewhere where there's a high humidity issue and they haven't figured out the ventilation issue and the humidity management issue in an attic, and there's just kind of like letting everything static or stagnate up there, I should say, then you walk into an attic and you'll see mold all over the framing, all over the place, right? And it's because you're basically in a humid area, and a lot of air conditioning systems are housed in attics. And so then what happens is that the mold, or that the air conditioning system, gets mold growing all up on the inside of it. And so now your air conditioning system is a source of mold because the environment that your air conditioner is living in is a moldy place. And then it starts spitting it all out all over the place. So humidity is a big thing, especially in the South. One thing I would say that needs to happen in the South, I see it all the time. I keep saying the South because that's where high humidity is, but in high humidity areas, I feel like you have to have a dehumidifier on your air conditioning system. You have to, because you're dealing with so much humidity that's coming in. Now, air conditioning systems generally, they do pull humidity out of the air. That's the process of cooling your air. That's what happens. There's only so much that it can do as the air is passing by. Like the air is moving quickly, right? So it's going to pull some out, but like it might not pull all of it out. Dehumidifying it before it hits your air conditioning system is going to reduce the impact of elevated moisture getting into your system. Also think about it. If humidity is getting into your system before it hits the cooling coils where it pulls the humidity out, then all the area before that is a high humid environment in your air conditioning system. And if you think about like how a system is set up, basically there's kind of like three components. On the front end, for all, those of you that are listening, I'll verbalize it out. So the first component is what's called the fan, the blower fan. This is literally the fan that spins around and pulls all the air through your system. That's the first piece, right? So all of your air goes through this, and this is what's sucking it through. The next compartment, which is the middle compartment, is your coil. And that's where the heating and cooling happens. So the air comes through compartment one, it hits the coil. The coil is cold, and to cool your air. And when that happens, condensation forms. So like anyone who's taken like a drink outside, right? You see condensation form on the outside, it gets wet on the outside. That effect happens because when you reduce the temperature, it can't hold as much moisture. So the moisture has to go somewhere, and it beads up on the coil itself, and then it drips down into a pan in there, right? So moisture is actually created in this box. And then when it comes out of that box into the third component, you now have air where the humidity has been reduced because the moisture came out of it when it was being cooled. And then that's when it gets sent out to the rest of the house. So you have these three areas where this stuff happens, okay? So the first area, humid air is coming in. That first area is going to be 80, 90% humidity in that first box. And all of your air is going to touch that before it moves through the rest. Meaning You could do a great job at your coil can pull, moisture out, and it could funnel the water away the way it's supposed to and not create stagnating water and bacteria issues and all that stuff. But the air would have pulled the mold and possibly even the mold toxins that were in that first compartment into the second, and it will push it all the way out into the third. So dehumidifying the air before it gets to it is important to help preserve your air conditioning system. And then the other big thing that I would never, ever, ever do in a humid place, and I see it all the time, and it just blows my mind, is fresh air intakes on your air conditioning system. So think about what a fresh air intake is. You'll have your HVAC contractor be like, hey, we're going to install this vent basically on the outside of your house that's going to pull air in from the outside. It's going to pull fresh air into your house. And it's sold as like you're getting outdoor air circulating your air. You're not stagnating air in the inside of your house. You're not doing that. Well, what you're doing is pulling in 100% humidity into your air conditioning system is what you're doing. So I would never in a million years do that. Even if I had a dehumidifier on it, I wouldn't do it. Like why introduce all of that humidity in to then have to figure out how to pull it all out before it contaminates your entire HVAC system? So if you're living over there, think about it.
So yeah, I because we moved into another new construction house and we did like some mold inspections like along the way, like as it was being constructed, because I was like a psycho about it. I'm like, okay, we just got done with this whole thing. I'm not gonna like end up in the same situation. But I'm pretty sure that that was like a part of it, is that they bring in air. It's like it's this vent system that essentially is like, what they say, hey, we're essentially just circulating a fresh air in your house. And I've never heard that argument before, but that makes total sense. And now I'm like, oh, I think that is like, I remember talking about that with the builder. And from my perspective, I'm thinking, okay, this sounds good. Fresh air, the inside of our house is pretty toxic, like bring in fresh air. But like, that moisture piece, again, like you're battling the unit to be able to regulate that. And if you're bringing moisture in, yeah, that's an interesting thing that
Well,
you
so
bring
if
up
you have that
there.
going on, then 100% you need to stick a dehumidifier before it gets to your HVAC system. So you have to like try to
Yeah,
pull it out at
yeah,
that point if you can before it gets there.
right. And you have to, and the thing is, like, you have to get those. Like, we had to, they were like, okay, no, that doesn't exist. And then you've got to have a dehumidifier brought in. It's like, it's so frustrating that we're not setting, our homes up for success. We're really just like slapping everything together. And then it's like, oh, well, when all the wheels fall off and everything is like going downhill, then, we'll remediate and then we'll put the dehumidifier. So anyway, that's so interesting that you say that, because I'm gonna have to go back and look through, because I feel like that was a piece of the building, construction when they were going through it. So so okay, for our listeners, I would love for you to give them some action steps, because people are going to be going through their homes now with a fine tooth comb and likely have maybe a coronary over like some of their findings. And if they're anything like me, I'm like, everything must go. We're going to burn this place down. Like, because you just get, it's more problem solving. And sometimes when you think you found one thing, you think everything has got to go. So what are the steps for people where they can feel like, all right, I can do something about this? Maybe notice some things, found some leaks, found some bubbling, whatever it might be, that kind of puts the power back in their hands to feel like they can right the ship.
Yeah, I think the information that you have is really important, right? Like I can go through a house and find all the things, but I will tell you that about anecdotally, probably 3/4 of the people we work with, they don't do the full remediation plan. Yet, if they came in with health issues, the majority of them are getting better. Because it's what I said at the top. You don't have to get no exposure. You just have to not be drinking 5 drinks a day for every day, right? And so
Yeah.
the silver lining on that is you don't necessarily have to rip your entire house apart. It's all kind of based on like what your health position is, what your goals, kind of where you're at, like what you're dealing with, right? And so if you're like way more sensitive, then you might need to do more work in your house to reduce exposure, right? But if you're pretty resilient and you're just showing minimal things, and maybe your exposure could be a little bit higher, right? But the information piece is really important. And then off of that, it's the priority component of it. So like when we work with people, yeah, we go through, let's say we found 20 things in the space. We'll still give you the protocol for how to fix all 20 things and like exactly what you should do and what order to do it and how to do it and all that stuff. But we also deliver a prioritization chart for you. And it says, hey, these, I don't know, 4 areas, these are like your top tier ones. These are the ones that are like the biggest contributors to your overall load. These next 3 are the next, and so on and so forth, right? And we break things down into like 5 different tiers for people. So when you go in, it's like, okay, I understand there's things going on. Part of the overwhelm is I have 20 things to do in 8 different rooms of my house. I just gutted my whole house if I have to do that, right? So part of the overwhelm is before you even get into it, you're like, holy crap, like I literally have to rip my whole house down. I should just go move somewhere else. And then you get down this whole other path. But the problem is other places have issues too. And then you start to feel trapped and you start to feel like that there's no hope and that you're just kind of doomed for this. And so like everything that we try to do is to give like a level of empowerment back. And I think information drives a lot of that. It's information and context are like the 2 things that really drive that empowerment component, right? So the information is finding everything. The context is, well, here's how we would attack this for you, based on your situation, and seeing kind of how everything lays out in the results that come through, right? So that's kind of the first thing. I think a general understanding that it's not always an all or nothing proposition, and that you can do a portion of reduction, but you should try to apply the 80-20 concept, meaning prioritize the areas that are worst if you're going to be doing a few things, because let's knock out the biggest contributors as much as we can, right? So the first step to come in, so if you're listening to this and you're like, I don't even know if I have a problem, I'm not sure, I don't even know if I would even want an inspection yet, like I just want some sort of proof, some sort of validation that, yeah, there is something going on here. So you can do that without even getting into inspections and like a big old, myriad of testing or anything like that. It's called the dust test. So it's thedusttest.com. I'm a co-founder in the dust test. And what it does is it allows you to literally collect dust with like a Swiffer pad from your house. Literally anybody can do this. If you ever cleaned anything, you can collect a dust test. And then you send it out to the lab and you can analyze the dust for mold toxins, even for bacteria toxins that are in your dust. Now, why the dust? It kind of goes back to why air samples, because you kind of chuckled when I said that about some guys coming in and doing air testing at your place. It kind of goes back to that. So the dust acts as a reservoir that collects things over time. So gravity is going to bring particles and things down to the surfaces, and the dust acts like a spider web. It just grabs it and it holds onto it. There's a lot of stuff in our dust. There's insect fragments, there's pesticides, there's heavy metals. All of this stuff gets into our dust. And there are research studies. There's a study out, actually several, that talks about this concept of the personal cloud effect. And the visual for people listening, if you ever watched Charlie Brown back in the day, there was the really dirty kid that had this cloud of dirt around him all the time.
Was it Linus?
He was the blanket kid.
Was it Linus?
Pigpen. Pigpen.
Yeah, what is the
So because he
Pigpen? Yeah,
smelled
yeah,
like a
yeah.
pigpen. Yeah, so it was Pigpen. So in the cartoon, he literally is depicted with a cloud of gross smell around him at all times, and that's how he walks around. Well, when we walk around our house, there is a cloud that follows us around, just like that. It's called the personal cloud effect. And basically what happens, every step you take, everything that you bump, every door that you shut, every curtain that you open, every movement that you make, every time you sit down on your couch, you're popping up whatever was settled on that surface up into the air, and it gets up into your breathing zone, and that's what you breathe. So being able to analyze at dust level, it gives us a more historical view of what's going on in a space, right? It's not just a snapshot of whatever's floating around for a couple of minutes while you try to take an air sample and hope it comes in there. You're able to analyze it way more in depth. So you're able to do DNA sequencing of the mold types that are there. You can identify toxins that are present. So you're doing a whole different types of toxicology analysis on it. And you're really able to see what your true exposure looks like in your space. And that now becomes, do I have a problem or not? You now have a report that comes back and it shows you. And the cool thing about the report is that we connected it to all of our data that we inspect. So it's not just, here's all your molds that you have, which is what other dust tests will do. It's like, hey, you have these molds, good luck, go figure it out. It's, here's your profile of what's in your house. And then we cross-reference that against all the homes that we inspected over a 3-year period and provided context. Again, context is so important to everything, to what this information means, to the point where we created like a percentile scale. Your home falls in the 25th percentile. of all the homes that were included in this study, right? So now you have an understanding, because like I said at the top, there's going to be mold in every house, right? Because there's always some floating around. So how much is bad? How much is not? What's too much? What's not, whatever it is. Getting a view of it where you can kind of see how it ranks against other homes that were expected all over the country gives you your first step in saying, hey, yeah, there's something here, but I'm in like the lower 25%. I'm gonna get an air purifier. Maybe I'll look around, but I'm not gonna like be super heavily invested because my health isn't super impacted and my house isn't a super high load of this issue. And so yeah, I'll do some proactive things, but I'm not like diving into it, right? Whereas if you do this test and it comes back and let's say you're in the top 90th percentile, which is like the worst 10% of the homes that we had seen, like, oh crap. All right, I got some decisions to make now. Am I going to dive into this and figure out like what's happening here and address it? Or am I going to leave, or what is that going to be, right? And so that's the first step. Everybody knows what a test kit is at this point, a home test kit, right? So like this is basically what that is, and it's super easy to do. So if you're even thinking about it and you're on the fence even whether or not like I should go into this, I would start there, right? Now, if you're somebody who's a little further down the path and you're seeing a doctor, you have your health symptoms, or you listen to this show, or you listen to other functional doctors, and you're like, yeah, mold is impacting me. You either know it through testing that you've done. So maybe you've done urine mycotoxin testing, maybe you've done genetic marker testing, maybe you've seen that your C4A is elevated, maybe these different inflammatory markers that are associated with it, and you're like, okay, I know this is happening, or I suspect it happening. Then at that point, it's really more about understanding where the problems in the house are, so you know how to fix them. It's not so much about, is there a problem, right? Is there a problem is a simple, let's grab
Yeah.
some dust and see if there's a problem. If you're to the point where like, yeah, I feel like there is a problem, then the next thing you need to figure out is where are the problems. So then we can go through that prioritization process that I talked about earlier, and you can apply that 80-20 concept to what's going on, get rid of your biggest offenders and remediate them properly, and then get back in the house and start, kind of recalibrating with your house and feeling a little bit better. But in order to do that, you have to figure out where they are. You have to know what to look for, kind of all the things I just talked about, right? And so that's where the inspection component comes into play. And to help with that, we're also in the next like month or so. Well, this is January, so whenever this happens, um, coming out with a source location mold test. I haven't named it yet, so like bear with me on it. But the idea is that it's a home test kit, but it's completely customized to your house. So where other home test kits, like the one I just described, it's a Swiffer cloth. Come in, do a Swiffer, you're good, right? Anyone's done a home test kit for like your genetics or this or that. It's like, here's your saliva thing. Here's you poop in this box and do this and do that. And here's your test kit. The kit is the same every time, and then is taking that information, doing something else. This kind of turns that around. The kit is completely customized to your house and to you. So if our goal is to figure out where the source of the mold is located, is it behind this wall? Is it in this ceiling? Is it in this cabinet? We need to understand your house and then custom create the test kit that's going to tell us where the mold is in your house, where it's hiding. And so that's what we've been working on putting together. And so it's a custom kit that comes to you. And then there's a mobile app that is attached to it. And with the app, there's a couple diagnostic things that we need you to take a couple pictures of for us. And then we'll be able to analyze all of that stuff the same way I talked about how we go through homes. And we're going to literally put together, you should be testing here, here, here. This is what your kit looks like. And here it is. And it comes to your house. And that way you don't have to worry, fly somebody out to my house, assuming you would be working with us, right? And then fly Brian's team that we inspect out to our house and do all this. For some people, that's just not feasible. Or maybe you're only concerned about like your daughter's bedroom and your son's bedroom, and you don't want your whole house looked at or something like that, right? So this is going to be that middle ground to be able to give access, to have, some affordability, to be able to kind of have a little control over how many areas in a house get looked at. And there's really no reason now, with the technology that exists and all the ways that we can communicate with people, that you can't tap into like the leading experts in the field and still get stuff at a reasonable cost and access for you. So that's what we're driving towards.
Gosh, when you mentioned that earlier, I was so excited for our listeners to be able to hear that, because having been through that myself, there's a lot of overwhelm because once you realize you do have a problem, like you said, finding the extent of the problem, it's, you kind of feel like you're helpless, and so you've got to outsource everything, and that's a huge commitment. I mean, it is a big time commitment, financial commitment, and you're still not even sure, right? Like, you're bringing somebody in, you're running, like, you're just spending hours going through, your house, and all, you're turning over all the stones, and then you're like, okay, we still haven't even, the work hasn't even begun, the remediation part either. And so I think that being able to like close the gap for people where it's like, okay, they can feel really confident that they have a mold problem that is impacting their health. It is like on the end of the spectrum where it's a burden. So it's not the, hey, it's a little bit of an exposure, maybe it's something else. It's like, this is a clear indicator, that this is a problem for the health of the people living here. But you're also giving them enough tools where it's like, hey, we can solve the problem without you having to shell out, 30, 40, $50,000 just to be able to assess what's like, the magnitude. Because that's where people are like, I either don't want to know, or I'm going to sell this house and get out of here and just start over, because I don't have the financial means or the bandwidth, to even take that kind of project on. So this is going to be so helpful. And that dust test is great. I started there too, because it's inexpensive and it's so easy, and everybody has dust.
Everybody has
So,
dust. Even when you tell me, oh, my cleaners were just here yesterday, I didn't realize. I'm like, don't worry, I know where it's hiding.
oh, your cleaners
No.
are not that good. I mean, yeah, I'm always like, oh, the house is so clean, and then I'll move a few things around. I'm like, oh, well, there's that with all the dog hair in the corner. So, but guys, I hope that this episode has been really revealing, maybe opened your eyes to some things that you've never considered before. And ultimately, maybe it's something that is putting some pieces in place for you to take some action on things that you've been struggling with because you just haven't had an answer for it. So I would love, Brian, for you to give our audience kind of the rundown of where you're at, because you're so good at giving people educational tools to be able to help themselves. And I think that that's what's so great, because you're deeply invested in businesses that can do the problem solving, but you're also deeply invested in giving people the tools so that they can help themselves as much as possible. And I love that about your work. So give everybody an idea of where they can find you, because I want to make sure they have
I
access
really
to
appreciate
this.
that. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, so there's a couple spots. So my company's called We Inspect. So our website is yesweinspect.com. So if you're someone who's, hey, I think I might want an inspection, I think I might want to talk about how to assess my place, whatever, you literally just go there. There's a big yellow button at the top that says free phone consults. And there you go. Get on the phone with my team. So like, if you're listening to this, you're like, God, I think I might have a problem. I might be interested in looking out. What does that look like? Just go get a free phone call. Like it's the easiest, freest, lowest barrier thing that you can do is jump on the phone. So there's that. I have my podcast, which is called Mole Finders Radio, where I talk through a lot of this stuff, and we even had Chris on the show a little while ago. So there's an episode, Dr. Motley, on there. I bring health experts on. I talk through all the ins and outs of the building, the home, how to inspect, like all that stuff. So, like I said, literally someone healed their child from listening to this. To the show. It's amazing to even think about that. So yeah, so that's on all the platforms. And then I would just say the last place, Instagram, at Mold Finders. It's where we are. So have a lot of stuff there too.
So great. Yeah. Your Instagram it's so good. I'm always, just when I think I know enough about mold, there'll be like a reel or a post you put up, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I never thought about that. So, I'm always like, reshare, because I have to, spread it to the masses, because these are real relevant issues for all of us out there trying to keep ourselves and our kids and our families healthy. So thank you for making something like mold so accessible, and you make it fun. I mean, it's like, you're just learning bits and pieces here and there, but you never know when you've got that one piece that you were missing that you just never really knew about. So I appreciate all of the work that you're doing, and we'll put all of these links and everything that we referenced here in the show notes for you guys. So make sure you hit hit those up later so you can get access to everything we've talked about. And yeah, I mean, I think that there's so much about mold. We could definitely do a part 2 on this whole episode, but I appreciate your time today, Brian. Thank you for joining us. Guys, like, share, subscribe this episode if it served you, and we'll see you on the next one.